Herzlich willkommen. Welcome again for this second day of the Rave Festival. A big warm welcome to Mahret Kupka and Eric Otieneo. Mahret is a curator here in the Museum Angewandte Kunst. Eric is an author who lives in Frankfurt. They both will have a conversation with Yagazie Emezie, who is locked in now from the Ivory Coast. So I hope we'll see her on the screen very soon and can give her a warm welcome as well. Mahret, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can you hear us now, Yagazie?
Yes.
Yes. Hello. Okay, so happy to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Yeah, and that all the technical issues had been solved. Yeah, first of all, I would like... before we start our conversation, I would like to introduce you quickly to the audience and give some bio, like a short bio of you. So Yagazie Emezie is a Nigerian artist and self-taught photojournalist focused on stories surrounding African women and their health, sexuality, education, and human rights. Having worked extensively across Africa, Yagazie also covers stories on identity and culture, social justice, climate change, and migration. Her art practice uses photography and sculpture to construct visual critique of Nigeria's socio-political state and the roles media play in it, pulling from history and current events. She began her journey in 2015 and has since worked with several media, amongst them Al Jazeera, New York Times, Vogue, Newsweek, Incorporate Magazine, Time, The Guardian, Washington Post, National Geographic, Bloomberg Business Week, and so on, and several non-profit organizations. Besides that, she has won several awards, received grants, and took part in prestigious residency programs like the Kehinde Wiley's Art Residency at BlackRock, Senegal. Yagazie is based in Lagos, Nigeria, but today she is taking part from Abidjan, when I'm rightly informed. And two work series of hers, The Beauties of West Point and Consumption of the Black Model, are exhibited here at the Museum Angewandte Kunst during the Ray Triennale on the topic Ideologies. We are very happy to welcome you here today, though sadly only digitally, and we are going to talk about your work series and your artistic practice in general, and that leads me to the first question, because when digging into your work, and I've been actually following you for quite some years now, and on your social media career, and then the photography and artistic career as well, and especially in the end, viewed from the outside, your career seems to have advanced quite quickly. Is this your perception as well?
It actually is. I started fully into photojournalism, I would say by mid-2018, and everything sort of took off by 2019, and then COVID hit. So I think it sped up quite a lot. So I would just agree with you on that.
And would you say which role did photo apps, also Instagram, played in that journey in photography?
As someone who's always been really into social media, I remember, I was a latecomer to Facebook, but definitely one of those, I'm probably going to share more of my age with this, MySpace days, Hi-Fi days. When Instagram came out, it just seemed the thing to do. But as my interest in photography continued to expand, I think one thing that platforms like Instagram gave was to give, a platform for people who really don't have that sort of visibility. And it gave me more visibility for an international audience, and allowed me to just push my work forward, which I would say is quite different for a lot of photographers who I am now on an equal footing with, not because I'm necessarily better than them, but because they started out with pushing their work in a time where technology and image sharing wasn't as popular as it is now.
Yeah, yeah. I think I encountered you on YouTube, but I think also like on MySpace already. So it's always like, yeah, it's like always super weird to always talk about like those MySpace times, because I think like many people today, especially like the younger ones, they don't really remember or never got to know what MySpace even was, that even is. And I still have the remembrance that it was like also quite easy to connect on MySpace. It is still in parts on social media platforms like Instagram as well, but since they grow so big and with like a huge followership as well, it's not that easy, I guess, to really connect on those platforms. But yeah, so yeah, I've been following your work for quite some time now. So for me, of course, it doesn't come like that quick, because I kind of like see and remember the development behind that. So it's so even more honor for me to be talking with you here today. Yeah, and I think we should dig deeper into your work now. And for this, I would like to hand over to Eric.
Thank you, Mahret. Pleasure to be on this panel with you, Yagazie. So let's dig into your work. So I was working around earlier, looking at the work. So Beauties of West Point is the work I'd like to begin with. So this is a series of portraits of women and men taken in Liberia, I believe. Mm. And this is a very striking project. For those of you who haven't seen it, please do.
It's up here.
Yeah, it's right upstairs. So take us through the process. So this is a portrait photography project, and it was taken in this place over a course of several months. So you didn't just go and start taking photographs. So how was the process like? Like, what led you to the city? How long did you spend with the community, and why did you embark on this particular project?
Well, my photography style is, I photograph opportunistically, which means it's quite simple. Whenever I have an opportunity to photograph, I will take that. So at the time, I was in Liberia working with a non-profit as their photographer, and this was like my first proper job in documentary photography. And part of the nonprofit's work was just really taking young girls who were living in West Point, which is really just this overcrowded slum, and giving them a better education. So we would visit the township often with a lot of social workers to just check in on the girls and check in on the family. And I remember my first visit to West Point. It was rainy. We were on these like little paths that, everywhere smelled horribly. It was muddy. But at the same time, I don't know, a lot of my work is drawn from nostalgia. And where I grew up was a very interesting town, to say the least. So I felt very connected to it in a way. And I remember seeing this woman taking shelter under this shed, and she had this like pink blouse, and I think it was either green or blue braids and a vivid color lipstick. And I just remember just seeing her in, the midst of all this like rain and people running through. And I was just like, wow, she's beautiful. I need to come back here. And it just so happened that I was always working in West Point, so it gave me an opportunity to actually meet and talk with the women. And I found that the way that they represented themselves when it comes to beauty, the way they classify what is beautiful, is, as it should be, very different from the Western ideas of beauty. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, is, just pushing the fact that there is no one set standard for what is to be considered beautiful. So how do I share that? So over the course of working with the nonprofit and working with the social workers to walk into the community, I was able to just maintain contact with these women and over time photograph them.
Oh, okay. And how did you deal with, because so this is a common thing, as a photographer, if you see a person that you'd like to photograph, that's the first step. The second step is actually approaching them, telling them about what you're doing, who you are, where you're from, and then asking them to pose for your photograph. So how did you deal with maybe hesitation that, the people had, or, preconceptions because you're not from the place, you're from an outside place? How did you negotiate? How was the negotiation process like?
Well, personally, as a photographer, I don't negotiate, and I very strongly do not photograph anyone that shows the first sign of hesitancy. If you're hesitant, that's a no to me. So that's not my practice at all. But I think with working with a community and it's very important to work with people. So given the fact that I was working with a popular nonprofit who was well known in the community, and I was working with, social workers who are also well known, and then the mothers and the sisters and the kids as well. It was just very easy to tell one person saying, hey, this is what I'm interested in. You have other neighbors who would be interested in doing this. And because I was already a familiar face, it really wasn't a difficult matter of finding people to photograph at all, and who are willing to just say, yeah, absolutely, take my picture.
And did any of the people you photographed, so of course they invited their friends to kind of also pose for your camera, were they interested in what you would do with the work, or were they just interested in taking the picture and then, going about their business? Like, were they interested in prints, for example?
So with prints, I just printed out the photographs and gave it to them as well. But I think the main part was also the timeliness of it. So they wanted me specifically to come after church on a Sunday, because once I told them, I want to see what you consider beautiful, to them, that was what they were definitely more interested in, was, just showing off, showing what they saw as beautiful. And that was the most fun part of the engagement. And of course, also them getting their images at the end of it.
And just paint us a picture of the setting. So it's after church on Sunday. You're probably in the vicinity of the church. I can imagine that there are a lot of people moving around, so it's not a studio situation where it's only you and the person you're photographing. So you're probably used to working in contexts where, there's a lot of movement, a lot of crowds, or was this different? Like, how was the setup?
It was different because I try and, put a lot of things into perspective, which is I'm not going to get people right after they come out of church, because a lot of them are going home or going to lunch or have things to do at home. So what I did was just closer, like maybe an hour or two after the church service is over, I go back into the communities, into like the homes that I know of. I'll say, hey, are you guys ready? And that's how we did it. We did it mainly just outside people's homes, but because of how tightly built West Point is, where you just have homes in really close vicinities to each other, we were photographing people outside of their homes. And one thing about, I really love about West Point is there's this vivid blue that's around so many homes. And I just use that as a backdrop. And sometimes, somebody would come and say, hey, I'm getting ready for the shoot. Do you want to come with me to my house? And then we just tag along, and it's really about just moving in between the communities and doing the photographing.
Beautiful. So maybe we could move on to the next project, which is also on display here. And the name of the next project is Consumption of the Black Model. And I find that in some ways it kind of ties into the portraiture that we just talked about. So I'm always interested in the work that didn't make the cut. So for the consumption of the black model, for example, I'm very, very sure that you had way more pictures initially and that, one or two did not make the cut. So which pictures, which images, which perspective didn't make the cut, and what did that do to the project as it exists now?
I mean, funnily enough, for the works that is currently on show, I was requested to give all of the works from the shoot. And my approach in photographing really is, I'm very careful not to overshoot, literally. So at the end of any particular shoot, especially with my personal projects, I don't end up with a lot of images. So the choices that I have to make are more precise and limited versus, okay, I have one image of, the model with his hand on the goat head and one without, which would be more impactful. I'll go with the one with the hand on the goat head to symbolize more of an ownership. Those were really the sort of choices I had to make, which was just kind of like a weeding out process, really. But not any big, decision between, maybe I should withhold this image because it might be a little bit too much. No, nothing like that.
Okay. And one thing that is striking, so for those of you who have seen the project upstairs, so they're very vivid images. We have props, so we have a table or a setting full of a kind of bounty, so fruits, vegetables, then there's a head, a goat's head, I believe it is, on the table. And it's really it evokes consumption. So there's a squeezing a lemon like the way you would in a dish. So I think this it's very striking to me that the notion of consumption is more directly rendered as actually eating, not just consumption in a passive sense, but like food, like actually eating. So which layers were you going for with this evocation? Like, because consumption kind of hides the eating in some way. So which layers were you going for in this case?
The whole, I mean, it's quite a lot, actually. It's multi-layered. So consumption of the black model was really addressing the different ways that we approach blackness. And at the time that I did the work, I was seeing a lot of photography coming out that was very much based somewhere in some African country. But I also noticed that blackness was being used as a prop. And this body of work was really calling out African photographers in particular, because what would happen at that time, even though now it can be interpreted differently, is, let's say, a fashion brand, and I'm sure some of us are familiar with that process, would have a lookbook to shoot. So they'll say, let's fly someone in who's of African descent from London into Nigeria or Ghana, or whatever the case may be, to do this fantastic shoot. But then at the same time, it was really this focus on the blackness of the model. And as some of you in the audience may not realize, but I definitely see it, is sometimes when people look at work of Black artists featuring Black people, it's not necessarily that they are looking at, the actual story in the image or what have you. They're just attracted to the sheer blackness of it, because a lot of viewers, especially on an international audience, are seeing blackness as an other, and this is why they are being drawn to these images. So creating that work was really to challenge photographers and their responsibility in, when you're being hired to do X, Y, and Z jobs, are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it because you know that this is what these Western publications or Western brands want? And there is a sort of responsibility when it comes to using a human body. So in this case, what I did was, work very closely with the modeling agency and with the model, which I think in the fashion world, when it comes to respecting people's bodies, because you have paid models, you feel more free to use them as is. But my main goal is, to sit down with the model agency, with the agent, say, this is what I want to do. Sit down with the model, say, this is what I want to do. Are you comfortable with it? These are the scenes that we're going to be created. And really actually make sure that they have and feel that, just have that right to their bodies, despite being paid models, but also to know that this is something that we are working on together, to make a point, not necessarily for, X, Y, and Z publication to carry us to another audience. That's a brief summary.
Okay. And one other thing that I wanted to ask you, so Beauties of West Point is an outdoor or kind of field project, in quotes, if you would say so, while Consumption of the Black Model is more of a studio project. So it involves models, it involves set design, all of that. So what are the differences in conceptualizing these two kinds of shots? So with Beauties of West Point, you mentioned it was also opportunistic because you're already in the context and you were looking, you were working in a different project. But Consumption of the Black Model, had to be planned. You had to have the models, you had to get the set. So apart from these, which other differences are there for you as an artist working in these two kinds of projects?
With projects like Beauties of West Point, because I am working with people of a community, you have to take time to build up trust. And once again, opportunistically, I was already there doing something else that put me in a position to build up trust with people. It's actually a lot easier with a project like Consumption of the Black Model because I had an idea one day, and this was just how I felt about this topic I've already talked to you about. And within 2 days, it was done. That was it. It was just like, I see this in my head. I want to address it, but I also don't want to write about it. I don't want to talk about it. I want to actually just show it. So, and it's also in Lagos where anything is possible. You can get anything done like that if you want to. So texted someone for the space, texted another person that I regularly worked with for the model. And then by the end of 2 days, we were done with the images. So I think the difference is really, it's kind of the leisure, I would describe it, with projects like Consumption that allow me to move a lot more faster and to quickly build the things that are in my head and make them a reality. Versus Beauties of West Point, you are working with people and you're working with strangers, and that takes time, and they are the ones inviting you into their life, into their home space. So there's absolutely nothing that you can rush with that, which is the right way to go about it, even though it's longer.
Okay. So for the last few questions, I'd like to move towards like in your work, you straddle the line between photojournalism and art. And I think you're very successful in straddling that line. I think for a lot of photographers, it's often very daunting at the beginning to decide, okay, am I going to work exclusively on creative projects or am I going to work on photojournalism? You do both, and you do both very well. So I'm interested in how you're able to do that work. So you mentioned already the opportunistic nature. If you're already in a city, if you're already in a place, you will take the opportunity to also shoot. But how do travel and logistics in general? You work all over the continent, mostly in Nigeria and West Africa, but also recently even in Malawi. So how do travel and logistics within the continent influence how you organize your work, both on a creative side and on a photojournalistic side?
Well, the first one would be, honestly, to acknowledge my privilege, which is I have the privilege of having a dual passport. And I sincerely do not think that I would be to what I define as my level of success without that, which is I'm able to travel around. I have my ECOWAS passport, and then I also have my US passport, which allows me to, ECOWAS allows me for West Africa, and the US allows me for the rest of Africa, really. And this greatly helps when it comes to getting work and just, being ready to go whenever an editor hits me up and say, hey, can you cover a story here? And it's not a problem, as opposed to my Nigerian colleagues. I don't know if you know how unfortunate the Nigerian passport really is for international travel, where they are just as talented, if not even more so, and are restricted by that.
Yeah.
So having the privilege of having 2 passports definitely helps me in my career. Logistically, thankfully, with a lot of assignments around photojournalism, that is really just handled by whatever publication I'm working with. There's already someone on ground that I know very often. It's very rare that I go into any new country blind. So the logistics is already pre-planned with the publication I'm working with.
Okay.
The majority of my personal work and projects takes place in Lagos.
Oh, okay. And Lagos is really, you just said anything is possible, and I think that really reflects the amount of work that is coming out of Lagos on a daily basis. I'm also interested in whether you draw a line, because there are photographers who would, draw a very strict line between the creative projects, the artistic projects, and the commission projects. In your case, I would wager that that's not necessarily the case, because if we look at Beauties of West Point, for example, it does exactly, it works very well in a museum context, but it will also work very well in a publication. So where do you draw the line between creative and non-creative or photojournalistic projects?
I mean, you already did the quotation marks, where it's like non-creative. They're both creative. Yeah. And there is, personally speaking, there's no distinction. It's just different approaches to working with different people, be it, someone who has just been interviewed by a journalist or a hired model. There's no distinction for me, because at the end of the day, my approach is coming out of my head, and that is a creative approach either way.
If there are any photographers watching, I'd like to ask this question, because this is often intelligence that is not widely available. So compared to what pays better, photojournalistic work or artistic work? Like, would you say it might be useful sometimes for photographers to go and do photojournalistic work if that is able to finance their creative work, or do you have a completely different experience?
Definitely the artistic work pays better. Okay. I think the photojournalism work comes in more consistently, but especially with Western publications, you have to basically build up a rapport, reputation with them for them to take you to that point of consistency with hiring you regularly. When I first started in photojournalism, it was jobs here and there, and now it's pretty much every month. However, the work that has traveled the most, the work that has paid me more in terms of just survival, has been my personal work. Okay. So with photographers, I always tell them it's actually quite the opposite. I find a lot of, especially my colleagues in photojournalism, doing the dates, and it's quite grueling. It's quite hard on the body as well, to cover these assignments, to travel around nonstop. It's hard on your knees. Your diet is crap. And you do that for, between $400 to $500 a day, if not less. Versus with art, when you sell one of your pieces for about $5,000, you're asking yourself, why did I do that 1 week of working in the sun? Yeah. Personally speaking, I love photojournalism. I'm slightly addicted to it, so I don't think that I will ever give it up, regardless of how much I graduate into the art world. So it's really a balance. Photojournalism, kind of feeds me. It's not, I can't find the right word to put it, but it allows me to live more. It allows me to live more wholly by seeing how other people live and interacting with people that I wouldn't normally interact with if I had an office job or even if I worked in a studio. And the studio work just really feeds who I am. as an individual. And photojournalism feeds who I can be for my community.
Mahret, do you have any other questions?
Actually, I think the question I had is kind of going back to what was discussed earlier. So I'm not so really sure if that makes sense at this point of time after in the program. I think we started later a bit due to technical problems. So I think I will ask the question that connects what you were asking about the differences between a photojournalistic approach and an artistic approach, and what you, Yagazie, said about some sort of responsibility, probably, or like a sense or a feeling on how Black bodies are being perceived in mainly white circumstances or white spaces, white institutional spaces, which is like in the discourse referred to as the white gaze. So my question would be, and then that's some kind of like a last question. I don't know if this can be really like answered. So maybe it's also nice to end a talk with an open question or with something that the audience and we as well can like take with us. So is there some kind of like a difference in a photojournalistic or an artistic approach to challenge the fact of the white gaze, or how do you do it?
Solid question.
Yeah.
I know that my work challenges the white gaze, but I do think that I talk about it more than I do. And maybe people tend to associate my online comments with my work. But personally speaking, I do not create when I'm photographing and when I'm doing the stories that I'm doing, I do not have the white gaze or the Western audience in mind. Yes, I do get paid by Western publications with a lot of my work. However, who pays me is entirely different from who I am doing the story for, and how I am choosing to represent people. And that's, at the end of the day, all comes down to my approach of working with people. As, believe it or not, as simple as it is, asking for consent, reconfirming it before I photograph someone. Are you sure? Which is, this whole thing of white gaze, at the end of the day, also comes down to how it's an action at the same time. And my practice is not that at all.
And
that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Just a follow-up question. So the New York Times specifically has faced criticism from audiences who say, okay, you have photographers who are from this community actually, but there's a power in editing, right? So I don't know how you deal with that. You have shot your images in the way that you shoot them. You have sent them in, but images can still be edited and be posed and contextualized in a different way. So do you try to kind of have control over the process? How do you deal with that kind of ambivalence in how your images will be portrayed? Because you don't know that when you're shooting the work.
Overall, with all publications, and it's not just publications I work with several nonprofits, I work with several individuals as well. There is a responsibility the photographer has a responsibility first and foremost. It's not about taking all these images that you can think of and, giving it to a client or giving it to an editor and say, you sort it out. So if I was ever I can give you a scenario, if I was ever in the middle of a riot and I photograph someone who is clearly distressed or covered in blood or has been exposed in an undignified way, and I photograph that, it is now my responsibility to decide whether or not I turn in that image. And I don't. There are different ways to photograph distress, and there are different ways to photograph people who are in undignified situations or circumstances and still make it very much human and still make it very much dignified. You know, there's nothing dignified around like, you know, stress or poverty or conflict, you know, but at the end of the day, so long as you are a human being, dead or alive, you know, there's still a way to work around that. And that responsibility purely lies with the photographer and the choices they make.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very
Thank you so much
for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate the time and the patience.
Yeah.
No problem. So enjoy your time in Ivory Coast and say.
I'm actually back in Lagos, but yes.
And,
you're back. Okay.
I also just got a sign from like the backdrop that Matthias Wagner also says thank you and hi and yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Bye. Yes, I think ich switche kurz auf Deutsch, dann switche ich wieder ins Englische zurück, um kurz zu erklären, dass anders als im Programm angekündigt jetzt Mohau Modi Sakeng nicht hier sein kann, der ja auch oben ausgestellt ist mit Yves Sambou zusammen, der leider kurzfristig aufgrund von Reiseschwierigkeiten nicht an einem Ort sein kann, jetzt digital mit uns zu sprechen und deswegen leider kurzfristig absagen musste. Wir haben aber, es klingt immer so ein bisschen merkwürdig, einen guten Ersatz gefunden, aber wir sind auf jeden Fall sehr froh, eine Person gefunden zu haben, die jetzt für Mohau einspringt und natürlich werden wir jetzt nicht über Mohaus Arbeit sprechen können im Detail, aber indirekt schon, zumindest wie seine Arbeit, sein Werk auch in einen Kunstmarkt, Galerienkontext eingebunden sind und daher so ein bisschen auf so eine Metaebene switchen und nicht über die künstlerischen Arbeiten an sich sprechen. Jetzt wechsle ich wieder ins Englische zurück, um Sakile Matelade vorzustellen, die jetzt hier ist. She is a co-founder and art director of the Frankfurt-based gallery Sakile and Me. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Hamilton College, a Master of Arts degree from the University of Sydney, and a PhD in sociology from Northwestern University before deciding to trade in a life in the academy to open an exhibition and research space inspired by artists she met during her doctoral fieldwork. Sakile and Me is an international exhibition and research space working with established and young contemporary artists, curators, critics, and researchers from the African continent and its diasporas. They promote the work and development of artists and researchers by investing in solo and small group exhibitions. And there will be an opening tomorrow as part of the Frankfurt Art Experience, a show by Raelis Vasquez. And Vasquez draws on historical, political, and personal narratives, and his paintings are figurative compositions that conjure the complexity of the Afro-Latinx experience. And yeah, before we dig into this figurative idea, because I have some questions on that, I would welcome you, Sakile, on the stage here with us.
Hi. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for being here and taking the time. And the side on this is that you are sitting here now, that we have like a real panel, and which is not that usual during these times. I also had like a talk on Sunday, which was quite weird to. I had to get used to speaking into a microphone in front of people again. I was a bit like, where do I look now? What is happening? Because I was so used to look into the small camera on top of the computer during like Zoom conferences or Zoom lectures. So it's very nice to be sitting here on a panel together. And I would like to open up the discussions with the topic of figurativeness. And Yagazie also said something about like this is maybe like my last question, like my last question in the talk we just had kind of led into this direction, because of course like in figurativeness, as one like defines it probably on a very like obvious level, deals with like the figure with like and probably also like with the body and the human body. It's a huge topic, so we are not going to dig into this distinction between figurativeness and abstraction. But where I'm heading to is actually like the figure as human body. And there is some kind of trend or focus of the black body. And as Yagazie just also said, is that there might be also some kind of like responsibility for the artist, or probably also for the creator, in responsibility for the context, like where the work is shown, what is discussed around it, because there are of course differences in the audience and how the audience perceives that. So you are kind of, I don't know, can I say like that you are also you have a focus right now on figurativeness? Because I have from the exhibitions I saw in your gallery, there is some kind of focus in it at the moment. How do you see that that whole topic? So because I don't think that you have like would you say that you're like specialized in figurativeness, but is it that a lot of artists from the African continent and their diasporas kind of like also focus on figurativeness at the moment, or are we just not used or seeing all the other art that is also happening there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank both you and Eric for inviting me, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. So I'll just first of all say I'm glad that I came early to catch your conversation with Yagazie, because I found that very not only enlightening from the perspective of learning more about her work, but actually it brings up some of the questions that I've had since we opened the space here in Frankfurt. So we are a young space. We opened during the Frankfurt Gallery Weekend 2018. So we are turning 3 in a few days. And recently we did have an exhibition that focuses specifically on figurative work, looking at artists who use the human form or the human body in their work. And the reason or the thinking behind bringing this exhibition specifically to Saki and me, but specifically to Frankfurt, was my questioning of exactly what you just said, which was, well, it seems like there is a sudden desire or almost hunger to see the representation of black figures or black bodies, but specifically by the hand of black artists, right? So there was in a way, a celebration of this. And this wasn't surprising to me, because for a long time, the representation of the black body has been by the hand of someone else, not a black body or a black person. Exactly. So it makes sense to me, or it makes sense to me that people are just celebrating the moment, that yes, it's almost like the image that I would give when I was giving tours and people would come in and notice that it's an exhibition that's focusing on figurative work, is imagine if you have been held underwater for a long time, somebody's holding your head down under the water, and so of course this is a metaphor, and then they release your head and suddenly you're able to come up for air. That is the image that I have about the consumption, as we are calling it, of the figure by the hand of black artists. So the black figure by the hand of black artists. So that was one part. And so the questioning that I had was on the other side, which I think Yagazie was bringing up, and I do agree with this, which is, but in what way are we representing or quote unquote consuming the black body, even if it is by the hand of an African or black artist, or photographer in this case. And I do agree with her that it is the responsibility of the person doing the capturing to sort of decide what they're including in that representation and how they're doing that representation. And I would go as far as to say, as you mentioned, it's not only the artist, it would be anybody else who would then take up that image or those images and use them, outside the studio or once they've left the hands of the creator, the person creating them. So the focus on figuration is not, I don't think it's accidental, but I also don't think that it necessarily gives us the freedom to not question or the freedom to not ask ourselves, well, what exactly is happening? Yes, it's great that there are more Black artists or African artists whose work is being represented, and it is great that they have an opportunity to represent themselves the way they would like to be represented, or to represent their communities the way they would like for them to be represented. The word that Yagazie used was in a dignified way. Right, because for a long time that's not how these images have been used, and so I am very sensitive to that, but I also ask myself, well, I do think that we ideally are doing the celebrating at the same time, but we're also having sort of an honest look at how we are representing ourselves, even when we have an opportunity to do so. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting to me, because one of the exhibitions you hosted was abstract, and I'm thinking about Otieneo specifically, which also for me was very interesting because so usually the work by African or Black artists that you see the most is the figurative work, the one that most people are able to recognize and see and relate with immediately. And in abstract work, you need to, take a few steps back to consider, so many different aspects. And sometimes you also need a kind of education or background in art to be able to understand or kind of decipher what is going on in the work. But I'm wondering about the possibilities for expression in figurative versus abstract work. So do you feel like figurative work is kind of, in a way, limited by its obviousness, like by the immediately recognizable nature of what is being portrayed, vis-a-vis abstract work, which, you need to interpret and take a step back from to understand?
Yeah, no. I think the short answer is no. That I think that there is a way to work with the figure and work with the human form and still have layers and require somebody to actually spend time with the work to come to understand what it is that they're looking at. That just because you have a Black figure, it doesn't mean you just have to spend 2 minutes looking at it and going, oh, Black body, colorful, clothing, great, and you're done with the work. Quite often, even the artists who are working with the human form in figuration, there are layers to their work. It's just a question of whether somebody is taking the time to actually explore that. Whether it's in the, as I sometimes feel like a broken record, but it could be in the material that they're working with. Perhaps they've worked with other kinds or other forms of material, and now they're exploring a different, a different form of something that they do care about and they have explored and expressed in the past, just not through figuration, right? And then perhaps audiences are drawn to the figurative work, but they have other bodies of work that is just as relevant and connect to that figurative body of work, right? And as you mentioned, Osi Awudu, I have a sort of a huge respect and appreciation for the work that Osi Awudu does, because he, in some ways, is an artist who I think is straddling, I don't know if this is a conversation that we have often, but sort of straddles when people talk about the modernists or the masters, and then we talk about the young or contemporary artists of today. And I do think that Osi Awudu is somebody who is sort of in both spaces and has shown that it is possible to do that without pitting the two against each other without sort of going, you need to have a full understanding of this to be able to move on to this, or you need to have a full understanding of this to be able to reflect back on this. And what he does is he merges the two and actually shows that they're relevant to each other. And actually they quite often inform, one quite often informs the other. Yeah.
Me personally, I actually think that this distinction between abstraction and figuration is like a myth, that it's not, you can't really, because that as a viewer, you don't really think to understand. Yeah, it's just like a myth, because you never really understand, like from the beginning on, what's there. And I think sometimes people only think that they understand it because they think they recognize the form. And of course, like in the case of the human body, they think like, it's a human body, so I got it. Which, yeah, but as you say it, there are so many layers to it as well. Can be. Most of the times they are actually, but of course, so that they think, okay, I got it, I understood it. And like, on the contrary, like with the abstractive art, abstraction, they think, oh no, I don't recognize, I don't see it, I don't see like anything in it. And yeah, so I just had like a longer interview on that exact topic. And with like figuration and abstraction, and also like how abstraction is like, so that's what I said, I don't really want to dig deeper into that, because there's also like a huge political dimension to the idea of abstraction, and how it's has been used and how it's still used in, but this would definitely be like another panel, I guess, to also like adapt that on like art and artists from the African continent and its diasporas, because I think there's, and what I was also thinking is that there is, there's just another way of looking at art, probably dealing with it, having responsibility as an artist, because it reminded me of this idea of like double consciousness, that you can't just like be there and produce something and get it out there. You always have to think like twice, what do I see? And then kind of like switch positions into how can my work of art be seen in what context, and taking care of that as well. So there's always like another layer to it. If it is art from, if it is black art, which I'm not so sure about that term, but maybe it's easier to label it that way here. So would you agree that this concept of like Du Bois' double consciousness also adapts to art production?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a practicing artist, so I can't really speak to the experience of what it's like to say, perhaps create something from an idea that I have in my mind, and then I find a way to manifest it and actually create it and then share it with others. So I can't really speak to that, but what I can share is in conversations that I've had with artists. I've spoken to artists who really do not concern themselves with the audience. The way they share about their creation is, I make the work for myself, and others get to witness it, and that's how I see it, right? And so then when I'm presenting work, because I do tend to go, well, I do care about how I present your work, so I probably end up spending a little bit more time about, well, which area of the space will this work be? Will it be the first work that somebody encounters when they walk into the space? But then how does that change the way they move and interact with the rest of the works in the space? Because, for example, if you, let's say, you're presenting a body of work that has some very striking and emotive pieces, and then it has some pieces that have sort of an openness or a lightness to them. The question is, do you start with the really sort of demanding pieces at the beginning, and then end with the lighter works, or do you start with lighter works and sort of have somebody walk towards the work that sort of pulls you maybe a little bit out of yourself, or requires you as a viewer to be a little bit more vulnerable than you'd like to be? So then I end up thinking about these things, and so in some ways I think asking yourself how am I seeing this work versus how will other people see this work? I do think it comes into play, but maybe with different degrees, depending on who you talk to.
Depending on who you talk to, I guess, because
exactly.
I think also the audience is different. That
exactly.
You're okay, who is the audience? Who will come there and what? So probably this double consciousness idea also adapts to a curatorial practice in a way that you always have to think, okay, who is going to come and what message do I want to give? And so I think what I'm up to is this idea of that you always have to think twice. There's always something else to think about. You don't do an exhibition, or you don't produce an artwork. You always have to keep in mind
other perspectives.
Who is viewing it. And of course, there's also the decision of artists to not
engage,
engage and not to think about it, which is completely fine, of course, because then you just produce, and then you kind of set your artwork free, and then it's out there, and people engage differently to it.
I had a question about your experience as a gallerist. So you have shown some photographers at the gallery. And so paint us a picture of the differences between the gallery setting, so for photography specifically, the gallery setting versus maybe an art fair setting, for example. So how is the work approached at these different contexts? And does the space kind of shape the approaches to the work, how the work is discussed, talked about, approached? If there's more discussion about the work in the gallery context or in the gallery space, or if most discussions happen in an art fair space or beyond that space. So what have your experiences been with the photographers that you have exhibited to this point?
Yeah, I mean, so we have worked with a handful of photographers, and I'd say one of the first photographers we started working with was Zanele Mohole, and we were presenting their work here in Frankfurt at the time when there were a lot of people sort of on an international, at least on an international stage, who were aware of their work, and it is figurative work. They were, they're self-portraits. And I would say I probably got a crash course masterclass speaking with Mohole, because Mohole, at some points in our conversations would say, I'm an activist. Because they use photography and they do express the process of using photography as a way of documenting, as a way of archiving, as it's not only about aesthetics, and sometimes the aesthetics are probably somewhere down here. You're really more using the aesthetics to pull people in so that they're paying attention to what it is that you want them to focus in on, quite literally, in the frame. I think from that, it did sensitize me. I mean, from conversations with Mohole, that's when we started our Instagram. And so the idea of thinking of Instagram not as a social media platform, but as an archiving device, or as an archiving, is an opportunity for you to share moments, or to capture different aspects or perspectives of experience, and share those into, with others, or, it's an opportunity to do that. So I did have or experience, it was my first experience with photography, or the way of thinking of photography, not as this casual sort of process of taking snapshots, but even then, when it is taking snapshots, it's still you're still documenting. You're still, in a way, finding a way to organize experience and also save, or for later retrieval, or to perhaps come back and do some kind of intervention in the work. And so some of the other artists who work with photography aren't so much artists who take the camera and go out and take the photographs themselves, but they, perhaps they use archival, like photographs from the archive, and then they do some kind of intervention on those photographs, and that's how they create their work.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Mohole specifically has described themselves as a visual activist. So I've never heard them speak of themselves as an artist. And I find this interesting because everybody's always trying to say that they're an artist, and they're always emphasizing that they are visual activists. The series that you showed, maybe just to give an example about the kind of work that she does. What was the name of the series? What was the name of the series? What were they engaging with in this particular series?
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough to be able to show some works from her Lioness series, and or their Lioness series. And what I appreciated about this opportunity is that a lot of people who were aware of Mohole's work were associating them and their work to the community engagement and the community activism that they had done with their own community back home in South Africa, and sort of representing and allowing people who are part of the LGBTQI community there, specifically in the townships, to be represented in a way that they would like to be represented, to share parts of their lives the way that they would like to share parts of their life. And so speaking, sort of connecting back to what Yagazie was saying, depicting dignified perspectives of those communities. And in the Lioness series, Mohole was specifically looking at racism, the objectification of the black body, or the consumption of the black body, and just their experiences. They get to travel around the world with their exhibitions. And one of the pieces that we showed was of a photograph that they took when in one of the many hotels that they were in. They're just taking a shower, and you see them with a towel over their dreadlocks, and their eye and Mohole's eyes are closed. And they described what was happening around that time, that they walk into these hotels, and sometimes just speaking of abstraction, right? People would see them walking in, and what they see is a black woman walking in. And they don't necessarily know where they're coming from, who they are, what they do. And Mohole describes pointing to a work that, that they did, and making a comment, and the one of the people who were working at the hotel just sort of brushing Mohole off, like who are you? Like what would you know about photography even? What would you, and they're like, and that's how people treat, just by looking at me. Based on what I look like, that's how people treat me. And so they were wanting to have other people who perhaps don't experience this directly, or don't have any personal experience of this, to consider what that might be like. And then to also, for those who know what that's like, to say there is an opportunity for you to represent yourself the way that you'd like to control sort of the frame of how you would like to be seen and viewed by others, or how more importantly, how you view yourself. Yeah.
But it's not necessarily understood in a way. I think that's because then there are all those layers, and if visitors don't know about like the backgrounds and the story behind it, they don't see it, or only understand like half of the photograph. So because I was like in Hanover at the Sprengel Museum, because Mohole has an exhibition there. I don't think it's still on, because they received some of the land of Hanover, like a city, like Niedersachsen, like Hanover, like an art prize, and part of that was like an exhibition. So Zanele Muhli is kind of quite popular in Germany right now, having like also the huge exhibition from the Tate in London coming to Gropiusbau in Berlin this year. So it's also like interesting to see how the popularity of they like grows in Germany as well. But I was there in Hanover and did like a tour with the co-curator, because Zanele Muhli curated the exhibition themselves, and they weren't there at that particular evening, but I had like a guiding tour with the co-curator and still there, and I was like explaining what I saw, what I see, what my like references, what the references are I see in those photographs, and it was like very interesting because even the co-curator didn't know that and hasn't like recognized like the story about like the hair, because there were parts of the Lioness series there as well, but also like other works. It was really like a kind of overview of the work, and there was this one photo series where there is like Zanele Muhli, like I think it's like a self-portrait, but there's also like a white person in it. And it is about like the hair, and it's kind of like, it's not really about like touching the hair, but you sense that there's some tension between like those two people interacting at one side in a very like close and intimate sense, but still you sense there is also like a tension again, because I think that the white woman's trying to, or white person is trying to touch the locks in a way. So, and I immediately saw that, and so we started talking about that image, and like everybody who was present, they were like, "Oh, I never saw it that way," and that's really interesting because it gives another meaning or another layer to the photograph. So, again, it's like you're there, you see like two persons, like two people in the photo, and you think like, okay, that's what it is about. And then there's like the whole the story behind it, layer behind that, and they were like, "Oh my God, we didn't know, we never saw that." So I think there's also the necessity also for dialogue and for I don't know if there's a necessity, but I think it's better probably to because then there is really something people can also like. I don't like it's like learn, but like more like experience. From the work, and the work can like work more deeply and more engagingly.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And actually, I've probably, since we started, I've received some, I wouldn't call it like negative criticism or criticism per se, but sometimes it feels a little bit like that. That when visitors come to the space, I insist on a tour, I insist on conversation, I insist on dialogue, and I've heard that that's not necessarily a very widespread culture or expectation when somebody's going to an exhibition. Unless you signed up for a tour, you don't expect to receive one or to be walked through and to receive context as you're experiencing the work. And I think I insist because of what you said that, yes, I think there is a joy in allowing space and room for discovery and sort of happenstance experience in when you interact with artwork, absolutely, without a doubt. Although when I know that there is something important that an artist whose work we're sharing would like for people to walk away from their work having either interacted with, engaged with, even if they don't understand, but they're aware of it, even if they don't agree, but they're aware of it, then I do feel that I need to give and offer some context. Because even if you you publish something, you have a catalog, you have text on the side of the painting, or you have a piece of paper with a press release, not many people really read, and even if they read, they don't, maybe because of the wording that we use, they don't necessarily connect with that. And what a conversation does or a dialogue does, it also opens up a way for the person who's experienced the work to say, hey, this is what I saw, or this is what I think, or this is what it reminds me of, and then I'm able to also share that with the artists, right? That wouldn't necessarily happen if they just pick up the press release and go with that. So I do insist actually on dialogue. So even if there is an event around it, the way that we have events set up like this, to have panels and to have workshops or to have an artist talk, but just to encourage conversation. And I think that sometimes in exhibition spaces, it is difficult to do that, because you even have sort of the shh, like you can't even talk in the space. Not just don't touch the work, but don't make too much noise. So I think it's great to have at least to have some space to have conversation around the work.
There's a contradiction. Excuse me. A contradiction that I'd like us to talk about, and the contradiction is about this. Yagazie also touched on it. The idea of a black artist or an African artist or whatever you want to call it, and with regards to a gallery. So the option could have been to establish a gallery and then exhibit artists of African descent without mentioning it. The other option which you went for was to establish a gallery and then explicitly mention that you're exhibiting artists of African descent. And I would like to know how you feel about this, because I have mixed feelings. I understand both perspectives, but I've had trouble. I have enormous trouble with the term African photography, for example, because that really puts African photographers in a very, very weird position, where if they make work that is not shot on the continent, that is looking at something else, either they're not exhibited or they're not discussed.
They're not considered.
They're not considered, right? Yeah. And I have clear examples of photographers who, whenever they get a residency, they go abroad and, really try to do work outside of that really tight frame of, for example, if you're a South African photographer, your work has to deal with apartheid, the colonialism, and then you have African photographers who, are in residence in Berlin, and they're like, oh my God, I'm in the Schengen area. I will travel to Belgium and shoot a series there. And this work is not talked about. So this photographer is actually known very much, but their work shot in Belgium is never discussed. They only discuss the work shot back in South Africa. So what is this contradiction, and how do you feel about it? How do you go about it? Like, what's your negotiation process with this idea of having to name something that is
I mean, we've had conversations about this, and the contradiction is, as I put it, it's baked into the circumstance and the sort of we say situation when we don't want to really get into the nuts and bolts of it, but there was a lot of thinking that went into whether to name the thing or to keep it ambiguous. And I think the naming versus not naming, for me, it came down to not really wanting to have a conversation with somebody who is wanting to stay in the realm of theory and not what's actually happening on the ground. And so I pulled from my teaching experience. So before I came into what we call the art world, or working with artists, or art in art spaces, the longest thing that I've ever done was be a student researcher, right? That was like a long time, my Sakila Matara student researcher for a very long time. And when I would be teaching seminars, and this is in sociology, there would often be a couple of students who would struggle with this idea of the social construct, or the idea of something being socially constructed. When we talk about a social problem or something that is considered socially unacceptable, at some point in history, people sort of gathered around that thing and developed a language to name it, to call it out, to say it's actually wrong, it shouldn't be this way. And you could you could apply this to anything from the competition between margarine and butter to the question of whether there is such a thing as reverse racism. So it's sort of the language that evolves with a people, right? And so in these seminars, the students who were struggling with the idea of a social construct would come to me, sometimes in the group when other students were around, sometimes at office hours when it was just the two of us, and they would say, it seems to me that by talking about race, we are keeping the problem alive, right? If we just stopped talking about race, if we just stopped acknowledging that there's race, because I don't see color, so, I treat you the way that I treat anybody else. I don't treat you any differently because you look different. So I don't see why we should insist on talking about it, naming it, but also expressing it. And so I found myself in the situation where I was like, well, I can't really answer this question theoretically, and I don't think giving an article or a book suggestion is going to help either, because if you have that in your mind, when you open a book that's about critical race theory, the whole time you're blocking it because you already disagree with it from the beginning, right? And so I thought I probably need to come up with or give a real life example of a place that exists in the world where people are attempting to work with one another in a mixed community and not name race. And I talked about France, the case of France, where ideally everybody there feels a great sense of unity through their Frenchness, through their nationality as a French person. And you identify as French, you know the language, you live there, you eat the food, you live your life, and the next person is a French person, and you just identify with one another as French. The thing is, in the everyday interactions and when people are interacting on the street or in the restaurant or in the hotel, right? People do see the differences, right? And some people do feel that, and they are treated differently because they look different. They're not white. They're not. And I'm not just talking about right now. I'm not just talking about anti-black racism. I'm talking about racism more broadly. And so when you're living in a community or society where you can't name the thing, when it happens to you, when something does happen to you and you have been targeted violently, whether it's verbally or physically, and it is because of the color of your skin, but you cannot name that it is because of the color of your skin, what that means is there's no way to name the thing, there's no way to call it out, there's no way to address it. Because if you don't have a language for it, then it's very difficult to sort of say, well, what do we do about it if we've decided that it doesn't exist, right? And so in the naming of Sakile and me, the sort of talking and describing what we're doing in that space, the question was, well, do we leave it open and just say, we're just a contemporary art gallery, and if you go and look at the roster, maybe you get a hint that we are intentionally prioritizing artists from the continent and the diaspora, then great. The thing is, I think living in Frankfurt, I'm relatively new here. I didn't really think that I had the privilege, I think, to assume that people would come into that space and actually respect and appreciate the fact that the work that we're doing there is to say we need more spaces that are being more intentional about including artists of African descent, artists from the African diasporas, not only for a one-time event or not only for a time of the month that makes sense because it's Black History Month or but that their work is important and needs to be seen, or people need to engage with it, and so that's really why so we did go back and forth, and I still sometimes have these mixed feelings as well, because not all the artists we work with think of their work as fitting under this contemporary African art umbrella. Because to them, it really just, it doesn't, right? And so what I tell to people is we intentionally prioritize artists on the continent and the diasporas, but we're part of the world, right? We're not only on the continent proper. And even those who are on the continent proper, they have experiences that are beyond those localities as well. And so ideally, we all have an opportunity to interact with one another and acknowledge how we're being influenced and how we're influencing each other. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically about, so when we think about photography, so at the Photography Forum Frankfurt, there's currently an exhibition, and one of the people exhibiting is Akinbode Akinbi. And I'm just thinking about the work, because there was a master class that Akinbode was involved in for, I think, 10 years, 2012, 13, no, earlier, 2010 until 2020, I believe. And it was held all over the African continent. So every year you had a group of photographers, about 12 to 20, coming to a different country. It was supported by the Goethe Institute. And it was just called Photographers Masters Class. And I love the idea of the name of the master class. And the book that resulted from that masterclass, which I can recommend, is called The Journey. But the book also has the title African Photography on its cover. And so for me, this was a contradiction, because the summer school was called Photographers Masterclass, and it was working fine. But the book that came out of the class, the master class, that has compiled the work of a decade worth of work, still bears this title. And I'm not sure all the photographers were asked. Because one of the photographers is the one I was mentioning earlier, who came to Berlin and explicitly shot a series in Turkey, because they were like, okay, I am an African photographer, but I will not be limited to shooting in South Africa only. I allow myself to shoot in other places as well, and for that to be considered African photography, if you want to call it that, but it's part of my artistic or photographic process. So that's why I think about this phenomenon very much.
I'm sure it was out of commercial reasons that the book was called that way, so it's easier to sell. Because there is like this trend right now that people are really like, oh, it's like art from Africa, photography from Africa, African photography. And so I think it's like, it was like an intentional marketing decision to call it that way, and to go also against the idea to explicitly not call it African masterclass from the beginning on.
Because the flip side of that, and this is the interesting thing, the question that we should be asking is, how many of these photographers would still accept to be part of the project if they knew that the project was going to be under the umbrella, right? And I have an example of a project that I can't talk about, where a lot of artists actually backed down after they knew that the project was going to be called African something. They were like, nope. And these are people who are born and raised on the continent. And the book is actually, it's a wonderful thing, and unfortunately I can't speak about it. But a lot of artists, not just 1, 2, 3, about 50 or 60.
I mean, I can speak to that back when I was doing the doctoral research. There were artists who agreed to speak with me, so with the interview, because I explained sort of what I was curious about. But here I am coming along, young student researcher from Botswana, asking questions to contemporary artists, where I'm in my research, I'm looking at how artists either are saying, yes, my work fits in this umbrella, but this is not the only thing about my work. And then other artists who are like, no, actually my work isn't about that. And so there's no reason for us to just focus on my biography or to focus on where I'm from, because that's not really what I'm concerned with in the work. Or that's not the only thing I'm concerned with in the work. And so there were some artists who agreed to do the interview, but it was still, there was still tension, because I was still focusing on talking about this and sort of asking them how they deal with it. How do you interact with curators who insist on only including your work in exhibitions that are about the Black body or about Africa or about, and when you are part of it, are there ways to sort of subvert or push back once you've gained access or not, right?
Yeah.
And so this was what I was dealing with even back then. So there are artists who I don't think, even if they appreciate the work that I'm doing with Sakila and me, they wouldn't want to be shown in there because they already know that when people are going to Sakila and me, they're expecting that they're going to be seeing, most likely, work that is made by somebody from the continent proper or in the diaspora or associated, affiliated in some ways. And so they would have to trust that when somebody does walk in, even with that framework, even with that mentality, that I would be able to sort of make sure that that person doesn't walk away from an exhibition going, I went to an African exhibition this afternoon, right? That they actually know something specific about what this artist is doing, what they're doing in their work, why they're working with this material, or why they've worked with several other kinds of materials. And if location and geography isn't important or substantive to the work that they're doing, I don't focus on it.
Yeah.
Right? And when somebody asks that question, I'm able to sort of reel it back in and focus on what, on the work itself.
But you need to do the extra work.
Yeah, exactly.
And also
Exactly.
because otherwise it's like with the publication scene, it's like very obvious who the audience is for that. Because I don't think that that people on the African continent need a book that is on African photography in a way. You know, like this, they want to experience photography probably. And so again, this is also quite tricky.
The contradiction is baked in. I think that's why I say that. That it's sort of it's a question of whether you have, whether you want to spend the time trying to detangle that knot, or whether you're able to continue doing the work that you would like to be doing, and the people who see the value in it and want to engage with it will, and those who don't. And I think in some ways, that's something that I have learned from talking to a lot of artists, both artists we work with and artists we don't work with, where they're, the question is, what do you want to contribute to? Yeah.
I think, we could talk longer, I guess, and open up more topics, but the time is over, actually. So, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you both for inviting me, and thank you all for your attention.
Yeah.
Herzlichen Dank euch dreien. Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful to listen. Very interesting. You didn't show many photographs. I guess that is to invite everybody to go up to the exhibition and see for yourself. And if you're watching from outside, do come to the Museum Angewandte Kunst and catch the exhibition before it's over. And you can relate to what the three people on the stage this morning talked about. Thank you, Mahret. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Sakili. I'm looking forward to coming to your gallery on the weekend.
Please do.
And wir haben jetzt eine Mittagspause und sind um 2:30 dann wieder online und für alle hier mit einem Panel, das das Fotografieforum Frankfurt bestreitet und weiteren Gästen, Kiana Mestrich, Johanna Diehl und Selina Lansford. Bis dann.